Welcome.
You are watching Line Screw 1.
Well, hello tubers. Hope you're doing well wherever you are in this crazy YouTube universe. Now that the What is a Woman documentary has been released on Twitter, and at last count about 130 million people seen it in the last day and a half on Twitter alone. So what an interesting and thought-provoking documentary. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and of course it got down to the actual root of the issue. What is a woman? And of course, if you watch it to the end, the definition was always hovering in the minds of those who could understand the concept, and it was answered at the very end very simply and eloquently. But there's more to the story, because if you notice when you watch the video, there's part of the documentary had Canadian roots in the story. One part being in Toronto and another segment over the phone from Vancouver. Now, as a Canadian conservative, I'm kind of tuned into all these stories, and I understand filmmaking in terms of documentarianism. There's a lot of things that have to be excluded because it ruins the continuity and the flow of the story. But there's more to the story, and I figured I would give my take on the Canadian aspect of the actual story to provide you some background, because there's often misunderstanding about how Canadian law and Canadian systems work, and the brush over in many documentary films covering stories that touch upon Canadian lives are somewhat misleading perhaps, or misunderstood, because our Canadian judicial system has its own case law. We have our own constitution, which departs from constitutions of other countries such as the United States. But let's get to the root of the matter, and then I'll talk about a review that the National Post newspaper, one of our national papers, actually I worked for National Post decades ago when Lord Conrad Black ran it, when it was actually a more conservative newspaper. Not so much anymore. Of course, Conrad Black went to jail in the United States. That's a different story. But let's get to the root of the matter about why Matt Walsh did the segment where he had to have the unidentified name from the man in Vancouver who was, I think he was misappropriately labeled as he was fined for $30,000, but he actually went to jail for 6 months involving a battle between his former wife and himself, and transgender hormone therapy for the child. Now, a little bit of background history and case law about how family matters work, and it's happened before in other issues with childcare and divorce when it comes to medical treatment. I'll give you an example. Often when a husband and wife separate and there are children involved in the divorce, the aspects involving the children in terms of family law are private matters. In fact, even divorce is a private matter. I'm actually divorced from many years ago, and no one can actually see my family law matters in court. It's not accessible. Whereas if I sued somebody, or if I had a criminal matter, anybody could pull up that file. It's public information. Now, in the past, there's been disputes between spouses going through divorce with medical treatment for children. Now, the transgender aspect is just kind of a new spin on, it's a new issue. But historically, there's been battles where, for example, one of the divorcing parents is a Jehovah's Witness and the other is not. And one parent doesn't want the child to receive blood transfusions, for example, because it's not part of their belief systems for the Jehovah's Witnesses, and the other parent does. So there's an opposing view for medical treatment. And generally the courts, especially here in British Columbia, and pretty much across the country, even though each province has their own court system, they've generally ruled in favor of the child's treatment, with the idea thinking that preventing a blood transfusion for a child having surgery could endanger the child, where it's pitting the religious beliefs of one parent against the beliefs of another parent. And generally the courts have ruled in favor of the children on that. And of course, these entire matters are private, and publication bans are very typical, especially if it's a high profile matter. The last thing the courts want to do is put the child's name in the public domain where the child has harm. And that makes perfect sense. Now, when we're in the 21st century, where we're talking about not blood transfusions involving Jehovah's Witnesses, we're talking about parents who are divorcing or divorced, battling over the rights of one child to have hormone or transgender reassignment surgery. That's a tricky thing for the courts. I get it. I would not want to be that judge. Of course, I know how I would rule as a conservative. But in this particular case, Matt Walsh was forced to actually not mention the parents' names. And in fact, if I was to mention the parents' names, which have been in the media and the internet, so I'm aware of the story, but there is a publication ban in effect. And what actually happened was the parent went to jail for 6 months, and the GoFundMe amount of $30,000 was ordered to be donated to the Ronald McDonald Children's Hospital charity, because the father violated the court order and identified the child. For example, just like me, if I was to mention even the father's last name, I would be indirectly mentioning the child, because the child obviously has a similar last name. So the father did not get in trouble and go to jail for the actual fighting for the rights of the child. It was for him mentioning the child's name in the public and violating the court order for publication. That's actually what happened. Now, I still admire the father for fighting for the rights for his child to not have these hormone treatments, because it actually wasn't gender surgery, it was hormone treatment. Just as the documentary alludes to the fact that there is really no good case studies on what happens when you give hormone therapy to children. You could be setting them up for serious medical issues later in life. So erring on the side of caution by not having this done is perfectly acceptable in my mind for what the father did. And like I said, I admire the father for fighting for the rights of his child. The problem was he did it the wrong way by violating the court order about actually identifying the child. So that's where he went wrong there, and that's a bit of the background story. And like I said, I can't even talk about who this person is and identify them, because I would be in trouble. Hence why Matt Walsh had to keep that person's identity secret. In the end, they wound up going to jail for 6 months for what they did. Now, let's get to the Canadian reaction of what the National Post had to say about the video. They got a few things right where they mentioned the documentary speaks to the core of the issue of what is a woman and what the actual definition of a woman is. A few fair comments it made was the scene where they went to Kenya and they talked to that indigenous tribal culture and how they didn't really have those kinds of issues, which is quite true in many, indigenous cultures around the world. But it did brush over the fact that there are other ancient cultures that have had transgender issues. British Columbia, where I live, has many South Asian citizens. And I've talked to many of the people there from India, and they talk about the transgender culture there. I forget the term for the people that they dance around, they show up at parties, you throw them a few rupees and they go away. They've been part of Indian culture for a long time, so this type of issue hasn't escaped humanity in the past. It's not completely a new issue, even though it has exploded more in terms of pop culture, and some people jump on the bandwagon just to get clicks. The Bud Light boy, for example. I guess it's one thing to be a transgender person for showmanship and clicks and be a performer, so to speak, and to actually be a transgender person. Now, even as a conservative live and let live kind of adult that I am, if you're an adult and you pay for your own surgery, you can do as you wish. I don't have a problem with what you do with your money, and if you somehow feel that changing your gender is going to make you happier and a more productive human being, well, good for you. But when we're talking about children, that's a whole different kettle of fish.